Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to do something for me right now. Just for a moment, I want you to close your eyes. Go ahead, close them. Can't think about the last time you felt completely lost. Not just confused, I mean lost. The kind of lost where you wake up at 3 in the morning and you stare at the ceiling and you think to yourself, how did I get here? The kind of lost where you look in the mirror and you don't recognize the person staring back at you. The kind of lost where you've been smiling so long for other people that you've forgotten what it feels like to smile for yourself. Think about that moment, moment. Hold it nice, because I'm about to tell you something that will change the way you see that moment forever. That moment, that dark, terrifying, humiliating, crushing moment that was not the end of your story. That was not your punishment. That was not proof that you are broken or weak or unworthy. That moment was the beginning of wisdom. And wisdom, my friends, does not begin in a classroom. It does not begin in a book. It does not begin when everything is going right and the sun is shining and the crowd is cheering your name. No, wisdom, real wisdom, the kind that changes the direction of your entire life, begins in the dark. It begins in the silence. It begins in the moments you are most afraid to talk about. So today, we are going to talk about those moments. All of them. Because you deserve to know that your pain has a purpose. You deserve to know that your struggle has been building something inside you that the world desperately needs. And you deserve to know, more than anything, that you are not behind. You are not too late. You are not too broken. You are exactly where wisdom begins. Let me tell you about a man named Thomas. Thomas grew up in a small town in rural Ohio, third of 5 children. His father worked double shifts at a factory. His mother cleaned houses on weekends to make ends meet. Thomas wasn't the smartest kid in school. He wasn't the most athletic. He wasn't the most popular. But Thomas had one thing, one burning, relentless, almost unreasonable thing. And that was a dream. He wanted to be a doctor. He wanted to help people the way no one had ever helped his family. He wanted to walk into a room and make people feel like their lives had value, like their pain mattered. So Thomas studied. He studied when his siblings were sleeping. He studied by flashlight when the electricity was cut off, and it was cut off more than once. He studied on empty stomachs and tired eyes, and a heart that was always being told in 1,000 quiet ways that people like him didn't become doctors. People from towns like his, people from families like his. He applied to medical school 3 times, and 3 times the answer was no. After the third rejection, Thomas sat in his car, an old rusted Honda that barely started in the winter, and he wept. He wept the way men weep when they finally stop pretending they're okay. He wept the way you weep when the dream you've been carrying for 15 years suddenly feels like a stone you've been drowning in rather than a light you've been following. And in that car, soaking in his own tears, Thomas picked up a piece of paper and a pen, and he wrote down one question. Just one. He wrote, what is this trying to teach me? Not why is this happening to me? Not what did I do to deserve this? Not why do other people get what I can't have? He asked, what is this trying to teach me? That question, that single, humble, courageous question is where wisdom begins. Because you see, most people, when life knocks them down, they ask the wrong question. They ask, why me? And that question, while completely human and completely understandable, is a closed door. It leads you in a circle. It keeps you staring at the wound instead of looking at where the wound is pointing. But when you ask, what is this trying to teach me? Suddenly, everything shifts. Suddenly, the closed door has a window. Suddenly, the thing that was crushing you becomes the thing that is carving you. And there is a difference, a massive life-altering difference between being crushed and being carved. A rock that gets crushed becomes dust. A rock that gets carved becomes a sculpture. Same pressure, same force, completely different outcome. And the only thing that determines which one happens to you is the question you ask when the hammer falls. Thomas, sitting in that car, asked the right question. And what he discovered in the months that followed changed everything. He discovered that in 3 years of applying to medical school, he had never really examined why he wanted to be a doctor. He had the passion. He had the dream. But he had never sat still long enough to understand the deeper why behind it. And when he finally did, when he finally peeled back the layers, he discovered something unexpected. He discovered that what he really wanted wasn't the title. It wasn't the degree. It wasn't the degree. What he wanted was to be in the room with people who were suffering and to know what to do. He wanted to understand the human body. He wanted to solve the impossible puzzle of human pain. So Thomas pivoted. He became a medical researcher. First, he went back to school. A different path, a harder path in some ways, a more obscure path. And he spent the next 12 years studying a single disease that nobody cared about because it only affected people in poor communities. People like the community he grew up in. People whose pain had always been treated as less important. And 12 years later, Thomas published research that led to a treatment that has now saved over 40,000 lives. He never became the doctor he imagined at 18 years old. He became something the world needed far more, and here is what I want you to hear. Here is the part I need you to feel in your chest right now. Thomas did not succeed despite being rejected. Thomas succeeded because of it. Those 3 rejections were not obstacles placed in his path. They were redirections, painful, humiliating, devastating redirections that were trying to point him towards something greater than what he could see. And the only reason he was able to follow that redirection was because, in the darkest moment, he asked a wise question. That is how wisdom works. Wisdom does not arrive with the trumpet. It does not show up when you're comfortable. It whispers in the wreckage. It speaks in the silence after the collapse. And the only people who hear it are the ones who stop long enough, who become humble enough, who become desperate enough to actually listen. Are you listening today? Because life has been trying to tell you something. It has been trying to teach you something. And I am asking you, right now in this room, in this moment, to finally stop running from the lesson and start receiving it. Do I know what it feels like to run? I grew up in a household where success was measured in silence. If nothing bad was happening, you were doing fine. We didn't talk about dreams. We didn't talk about ambitions or passions or calling. We talked about survival. We talked about getting through the week, getting through the month, making sure the lights stayed on and there was food in the refrigerator. And I absorbed that. I absorbed the belief that dreaming was a luxury, that hope was something other people could afford. That people like us, we kept our heads down, we worked hard, we were grateful for what little we had, and we did not dare want more. I carried that belief like a backpack. All through my childhood, all through my teenage years, I carried it so long, I forgot it was there. I thought the weight was just life. I thought feeling small was just normal. And then one day, I was 19 years old. I sat in a library and I opened a book. I don't even remember what I was looking for. I wasn't even supposed to be in the library that day. I was killing time before a bus. And I opened this book, and on the very first page, there was a quote, a single sentence, and it read, "The beginning of wisdom is the discovery of our own ignorance." I must have read that sentence 15 times. And then I put the book down and I sat very still. Because something had just cracked open inside me. Some door that had been locked for 19 years had just come off its hinges. Because in that moment I realized I had been living inside a story that was not mine. I had been carrying beliefs that were handed to me before I was old enough to question them. And my ignorance, my beautiful, humbling, uncomfortable ignorance, was the first gift I had ever given myself. Because once I knew that I didn't know, I could start learning. Once I knew that the map I'd been following was wrong, I could start drawing a new one. That was the day my life actually began. Not the day I was born. The day I discovered I was ignorant, daughter. And I say this with absolute love. You are ignorant too, every single one of you. Not as an insult. As the highest compliment I can give you. Because the wisest people who have ever lived were the ones who most clearly understood how much they did not know. Socrates, one of the greatest philosophers in human history, said his only wisdom was knowing that he knew nothing. Einstein said imagination is more important than knowledge. And the reason wisdom requires that starting point, that radical, uncomfortable humility, is because you cannot pour water into a cup that is already full, pour it into every room already knowing. If you meet every challenge already certain, if you approach every person already decided, you will never grow, you will never change, you will never discover what you are actually capable of because you will spend your whole life defending what you already believe instead of expanding it. The beginning of wisdom is the moment you say, I don't know, I might be wrong, I have more to learn, and I know. I know that in a world that rewards confidence, that worships certainty, that promotes the loudest and the most assured voices, admitting you don't know feels danger or no feels dangerous. It feels weak. It feels like you're falling behind while everyone else has it figured out. But let me tell you a secret about all those people who seem to have it figured out. They don't there's a single one of them. The most successful people I have ever met, and I have been privileged to stand in rooms with extraordinary human beings. Every single one of them will tell you that the moment they started winning was not when they finally had all the answers. It was when they finally became comfortable with the questions, when they stopped performing certainty and started practicing curiosity, when they traded the armor of ego for the openness of a student that was. Here is what nobody tells you about knowledge. Knowledge alone is not wisdom. You can fill your head with facts and figures and still make the same painful mistakes over and over again. You can know everything about nutrition and still starve yourself emotionally. You can study psychology and still choose people who hurt you. You can read every business book ever written and still sabotage yourself at the moment of your greatest opportunity. Knowledge without wisdom is a map without legs. It doesn't move you anywhere. Wisdom is different. Wisdom is what happens when knowledge passes through experience, through suffering, through failure, through love, through loss, and comes out the other side transformed. Wisdom is not what you know. Wisdom is what you understand. And real understanding requires more than reading. It requires living. It requires making mistakes. It requires falling down in front of people and getting back up anyway. It requires the courage to be a beginner again and again and again and again. Let me tell you about a woman named Sarah. Sarah was a marathon runner. Not professionally, she had a day job, a family, a full life. But running was her identity. It was the thing that made her feel alive, feel capable, feel like herself. She had run 11 marathons over 15 years. It was her church. It was her therapy. It was the place where she could be quiet and strong and free. And then at 42 years old, Sarah was diagnosed with an autoimmune condition that attacked her joints. Overnight, the thing she loved most became the thing that hurt her most. She couldn't run anymore. Not a full marathon. Not even a mile. Some mornings she could barely walk down the stairs. Sarah went through a grief that most people never saw. Because from the outside she looked fine. She still went to work. She still made lunches for her kids. She still smiled at the school gate. But inside, she was losing the version of herself she had built over 15 years. She was mourning the person she thought she was. And the grief turned into bitterness. And the bitterness turned into isolation. And the isolation turned into a quiet, steady depression that sat on her chest every morning like a stone. For 2 years, Sarah lived like this. And then one day, not a dramatic day, not a day with a sunrise and a revelation, but an ordinary Tuesday, her youngest daughter, who was 8 years old, came home from school and said, "Mommy, our teacher asked us today what our parents teach us. What our parents teach us." And I said, "You teach me that when something's too hard, you stop." Sarah told me later that she didn't cry in front of her daughter. She waited until she was alone. And then she cried for a very long time. Not because her daughter was cruel. Her daughter was simply describing what she had witnessed. But because Sarah realized in that moment that the story she was living was becoming the story her daughter would tell about what it means to face a hard thing. And Sarah made a decision not to run. She couldn't run, but to find out what she could do to become again a beginner. To start from scratch, from zero, from humility, from the bottom of a new mountain she'd never climbed before. She started swimming. She had never been a swimmer. She was bad at it, actually. Awkward and slow and out of breath in ways that felt absurd after 15 years of running marathons. But she showed up. Every morning in a pool surrounded by teenagers who were faster than her, she showed up. And she learned. And she struggled. And she got a little better. And she struggled some more. 18 months later, Sarah completed an open water swimming race, 3 kilometers in a lake, at 5 in the morning, in water that was uncomfortably cold. She crossed the finish line and she sobbed. Not because she had won, she finished near the back, but because she had discovered something about herself that the running had never revealed. She discovered that her strength was not in her legs. It was in her willingness to begin again. And her daughter, that 8-year-old girl who had once said that her mother taught her to stop when things got hard. Her daughter was standing at the finish line that morning with a handmade sign that said, "My mom teaches me that you can start over. That is wisdom." That is what wisdom looks like when it is lived rather than read. It is not a moment of sudden clarity at the top of a mountain. It is 18 months of swimming badly in a pool before you realize you've been transformed. But I want to ask you, right now, what are you refusing to begin again in? What chapter of your life have you written off because the version you imagined didn't survive contact with reality? What identity have you buried because the world told you it was finished? Because I promise you with everything I have, that the thing you think is the ending is actually an invitation to become something you have never been, to discover a strength you didn't know you had, to write a chapter of your story that the old version of you could not have written, because the old version of you had not yet been shaped by the struggle that makes this chapter possible. The beginning of wisdom is not starting at your best. It is being willing to start at your worst, at your worst. Now I need to talk about something that nobody likes to talk about, something that sits in the room with every one of us and we pretend isn't there. I need to talk about fear, not the fear of spiders or heights or public speaking. I mean the deep fear, the foundational fear. I mean the deep fear, the foundation. The fear that lives underneath all the other fears and drives almost every bad decision, every avoidance, every self-sabotage that has ever held you back. I'm talking about the fear that you are not enough. That if people really saw you, all of you, the mess and the doubt and the shame and the embarrassing history, they would leave. That your success is a fraud waiting to be exposed. That somewhere, somehow you got here by accident. And it's only a matter of time before everyone else figures out what you already secretly believe. That you are not as smart, not as capable, not as worthy as you appear. That fear has a name. Psychologists call it imposter syndrome. But I think that name is too clinical for how it actually feels. Because it doesn't feel like a syndrome. It feels like truth. It feels like the most honest thing about you. It feels like the one thing you know for certain in a world of uncertainty. And here is the devastating, beautiful irony of that fear. The people who feel it most intensely are almost always the people who are growing the fastest, the people who are reaching the hardest, the people who are doing something genuinely difficult and genuinely new. Because if you never take risks, you never feel like a fraud. If you always stay inside the boundaries of what is comfortable and familiar and proven, you never have to face the terrifying question of whether you belong in the new territory. The fear of not being enough is not evidence that you are not enough. It is evidence that you are trying to become more than you currently are. And that reaching, that straining, that terrifying leap towards something bigger, that is not weakness. That is the bravest thing a human being can do. I want to tell you about a speech that Abraham Lincoln gave early in his political career. He was young, mid-20s, and he was asked to speak at a public event, and he was so terrified that he physically shook on the platform. He stumbled over words. He lost his place. He looked out at the crowd and felt absolutely certain that he had humiliated himself. He went home that night convinced he was not made for public life, that he should go back to being a lawyer in Springfield and stop pretending he had something to say that the world wanted to hear. That man, that terrified, stumbling, self-doubting young man, became one of the greatest orators in the history of the world. He delivered speeches that freed an entire people. He spoke words that are still being quoted, still being carved into monuments, still being taught to children. Over 150 years later, what changed between that stumbling young man and the president who stood at Gettysburg? Not talent. No, talent. He had talent all along, not intelligence. He had that too. What changed was that he chose over and over again, in the face of fear, in the face of failure, in the face of a country that told him he was too poor and too ugly and too rough, he chose to keep showing up. He chose to keep speaking. He chose to treat each failure as a classroom rather than a verdict. And somewhere along the way, the fear didn't disappear. It never disappeared. But wisdom grew larger than the fear. And when wisdom is larger than fear, you can act anyway. You can speak anyway. You can lead anyway. You can love anyway. You can try anyway. That is the only goal. Not to eliminate fear. To grow large enough that fear stops being the last word. And growing that large requires exactly what we've been talking about. It requires humility. It requires the willingness to be a beginner. It requires asking, what is this teaching me? instead of why is this happening to me. It requires the courage to begin again and again and again. And it requires, above all, the wisdom to understand that every single person in this room, every single person who has ever achieved anything meaningful, has stood exactly where you are standing right now, uncertain, afraid, unsure, and choosing to go forward anyway. Dudley, slow down for a moment. I want to talk about something quieter, something that gets lost in the noise of motivational speeches and the loudness of hustle culture and the relentless pressure to be more, do more, achieve more, become more. I want to talk about the wisdom of stillness. We live in a world that is terrified of silence. We fill every quiet moment with noise, with our phones, our podcasts, our constant scrolling, our running commentary on our own lives. We have built an entire civilization designed to help us avoid being alone with our own thoughts. And I deeply, genuinely think that this avoidance is one of the most expensive things we have ever done to ourselves. Because wisdom does not shout, wisdom whispers. And in a world of constant noise, the whisper never gets heard. The ancient traditions knew this. Every wisdom tradition in human history, from the Greek philosophers to the Buddhist monks to the desert fathers of Christianity to the indigenous elders of every continent, all of them, without exception, identified silence and solitude as prerequisites for genuine understanding. They didn't see stillness as laziness. They saw it as the highest form of attention. They understood that you cannot receive what you are too busy to hear. And here in the 21st century, we have more access to information than any human being who has ever lived. We can know anything in seconds. We can learn from the greatest minds in history with the touch of a button. We are drowning in knowledge, and yet, look around. Look at the rates of anxiety. Look at the rates of depression. Look at the epidemic of loneliness in a world more connected than ever. Look at the number of people who, despite having access to everything, feel like they have nothing that matters. Who, despite being surrounded by people, feel completely alone. Who, despite consuming endless content, feel completely empty. We have more knowledge than any people who have ever lived, and less wisdom than we need. And the gap between what we know and how we live is silence. It is the practice of sitting with yourself long enough to actually hear what you believe, what you value, what you want, what you fear, what you love. It is the practice of being present to your own life instead of perpetually distracted from it. I am not asking you to become a monk. I am not asking you to meditate for 4 hours a day or retreat to a cave or throw away your phone. I am asking you to find, to create, to protect some amount of time every day that is yours. Quiet time, honest time. Time when the noise stops and you can finally hear yourself think. Because here is what I know. The answers you are looking for are mostly inside you. The direction you are trying to find is mostly already in you. The wisdom you are reaching for is not in the next book or the next podcast or the next motivational video. It is in the quiet that you keep running from. It is in the honest conversation you have been avoiding with yourself. And yes, that conversation is uncomfortable. Because when the noise stops, the real questions surface. The questions you've been burying. Am I living the life I actually want or the life I think I'm supposed to want? Am I in this relationship because I love this person or because I'm afraid to be alone? Am I in this career because it fulfills me or because I've invested too much to change course now? Am I the parent, the partner, the friend, the person I want to be? Or am I just performing a version of those things because I don't know how to be anything else? Those questions are terrifying. I know they are. I have sat with every one of them. And they do not feel like the beginning of wisdom. They feel like the beginning of a crisis. But here is what I've learned. The crisis and the beginning of wisdom are the same moment. They are the same moment. They are the same door. One side says crisis. The other side says breakthrough. And the only thing that determines which side you land on is whether you have the courage to walk through it. Please, walk through it, Dorothy. On the other side of that honest conversation with yourself is clarity, real clarity. Not the artificial clarity of certainty, not the false peace of pretending you know, but the deep clarity of someone who has looked honestly at their life and decided, with full awareness, how to live it. Someone who has stopped sleepwalking and started choosing. And that choice, that conscious, courageous, fully awake choice, is the beginning of a life that is actually yours. Now let me talk about the people around you. Because wisdom does not happen in isolation. It happens in relationship. It happens really. It happens in the friction and the love and the disappointment and the joy and the loss that comes from being genuinely connected to other human beings. And one of the most important forms of wisdom, one that takes most of us decades to develop, is the wisdom of choosing our people wisely. I want you to think about the 5 people you spend the most time with, not the people you follow on social media, the people who are actually in your life, the people whose voices you hear most often, the people whose opinions shape how you see yourself. Are those people pulling you higher? Are those people challenging you to become more, to think bigger, to live braver? Or are those people, out of their own fear, their own limitation, their own unexamined beliefs, quietly, consistently, lovingly holding you back?